Welcome to Resilience Media Productions. I'm Leslie Hitchcock, co-founder of Resilience Media, and I am here today with Rob Murray, Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council and Assistant Professor of Practice at Johns Hopkins University. Rob has recently been on stage at the Future of Defense Tech Manufacturing and Innovation event that Resilience Media co-produced with the U.S. Defense Innovation Unit in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. And there he appeared on a panel about the future of defense funding and wanted to follow up on that panel to have a longer conversation with Rob about the topic that he came on the panel to discuss, which is a defense, security, and resilience bank. Rob, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Leslie. Lovely to see you again.
Let's set the scene. Tell us why this matters.
I mean, look at the geopolitical context right now. The security architecture around Europe is absolutely being rewritten. So fundamentally, what does that mean? It means we're going to have to reimagine how we fund for defense and how we actually spend that money. And so, we're seeing on Sunday, the 2nd of March, there's an emergency European leaders meeting in London. Talking about this very topic. And there is a real need to get money and capital into nation states so that they can rearm and buy equipment to be able to protect, quite frankly, nations and deter against Russia. Now, when we think about that, there's only really a few ways you can generate money and capital very quickly, noting, of course, that in Europe at least, productivity and growth right now is really hard and quite low across the entire continent. So we're not really going to grow our way to more money at the moment, at least. So that leaves very few options. You can, of course, raise taxes, but that is pretty unpopular with the population, to say the least. You can reallocate money from existing spending priorities, perhaps education, healthcare, infrastructure, whatever, and reallocate that to defense. But that also is very hard for nations to swallow. And of course, you can borrow. You can borrow the money. And so fundamentally, what this work is on the Defense, Security and Resilience Bank is really, and it's a culmination of 5 years of research and work and engagement with Ministries of Defense, Ministries of Finance, Ministries of Foreign Affairs. And it's pretty straightforward. Why does this matter? This matters because we need multiple instruments, and the DSR Bank being one, that can genuinely bring about quick capital at a scale we haven't probably seen for a very, very long time, at a very cheap rate that allows nations to start spending on defense very fast. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is that even if, let's imagine, all of the money in the world dropped on Ministries of Defense tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to spend it because we have a problem when it comes to procurement and contracting. That is a problem. I saw this. I worked in NATO on the Secretary General's staff for nearly 10 years. I saw this very clearly, and it's a problem that exists in all nations. And so by having a multilateral bank like the DSR Bank, not only could you provide super cheap capital to nations, point one, but when you lend that money to nations, you would put conditions into the loan agreement, just like you and I have when we borrow money to have a mortgage or buy a car or whatever. But these conditions would be, okay, if country X wants to buy a swarm of drones, for argument's sake, sort of hundreds of millions and production capacities and goodness knows what, then they've got to make sure they're the right technical standards. They've got to make sure they're interoperable where they need to be. They've got to make sure that they perhaps have the right sorts of electronic warfare capabilities with them. And that all needs to be done perhaps within, 12 months, 18 months, pick a deadline, and. And the point here is that you then start to nudge the procurement processes and such that you tie money to acquisition. So why does this matter? Point one is super cheap money. Point two, it helps nudge procurement processes in countries. But even if you get those two things right, you've still got a really big problem. And the problem is there isn't the production capacity to make all this stuff. And so therefore, one of the reasons there isn't that capacity is because commercial banks are not providing credit into defense companies of all sizes. And the reason that is the case is because they viewed those companies dealing with defense as a credit risk and as a compliance risk. And so what you need is a multilateral bank like the DSR bank to underwrite and provide guarantees to the commercial banks such that credit can flood into the sector and then broaden and build capacity. So why does this matter, this bank? 3 reasons. Super cheap capital for nations very fast, helping nudge on the procurement side such that we actually get the things we need when we need them, but then also providing guarantees to commercial banks to unlock the supply chain and build production capacity.
So we're at a turning point as the West, and obviously something a lot of the conversation at Munich Security Conference was about funding. So this is, one really strategic way that can be eased. Can you give us a real world impact of not having something like a DSR bank?
Yeah, sure. So if we don't have the level of financing that's necessary, I mean, look, very simply, you are just not going to be able to finance the required needs of military armament, of ammunition, of necessary infrastructure and so forth to be able to genuinely deter. We're in a geopolitical situation here, which you're absolutely right to highlight Munich. I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago now, and it was barely 2 weeks ago, where the geopolitical landscape has changed. And when I first listened to the remarks being made, not only in Munich, but also in the lead up with, Pete Hegseth's remarks at the NATO Defense Ministerial a day or two beforehand, signposting where the United States was going, and then also the remarks at the Munich Security Conference, and a day or so after when you saw the United States and Russia negotiating in Saudi Arabia. And my instinct was, okay, this is actually a renegotiation of the end of the Cold War. That's what's going on here. Since then, a week or so on, and having reflected on it further, I actually think that's wrong. It's not a renegotiation of the end of the Cold War. It is a redrawing of Europe's security architecture from the end of the Second World War. And so if, for example, the United States decides that China is a bigger concern for the United States, and therefore a lot of the resources that are in Europe, American resources, 100,000 troops, various armaments all over the place. If the United States feels that actually it doesn't make strategic sense for the United States to keep all of that in Europe and wants to redeploy it to deter China, then you're going to need DSR Bank to be able to finance and backfill what is huge amounts of expenditure. And so that cannot be underestimated. And I think the scale of investment, no way can that be done by any one nation. And to be honest, it can't really be done by Europe alone. And I think this is where it gets very complicated with the political environment versus the grand strategic needs. And so we can think about, okay, if you don't have this sort of institution, a DSR bank that's looking both transatlantically, but also in the Indo-Pacific region, because we are seeing the global lines being redrawn, which means we need new global architectures put in place. If we don't have something like this, then we're going to be at a real vulnerability and a real risk of that Russian aggression on the borders of Europe.
So this is a new way to strengthen security.
I mean, I think what we're seeing here, in simple terms, is the need to bring capital markets together with national security. We've never, to my knowledge, we've never really done that at a meaningful level. I think in the last few years, everyone's got, very engaged with regards to venture capital for defense and defense startups. And that's great. That's brilliant. As the guy who designed the NATO Innovation Fund, I'm a big proponent of venture capital. But the scale of investment required makes VC is just no way venture capital. A, it's not the right instrument, and B, it's just nowhere near enough. We have to go deep into capital markets, and so this is about bringing together finance and security in a way which I don't think we've really seen before.
Yeah. So let's get into a tangible conversation around what a DSR bank will actually do. practical terms, what kind of projects would a DSR bank fund?
Yeah, so the way these banks are established as multilateral banks is that there's about 40 of them globally. And so the World Bank, European Investment Bank, IMF, etc. And they all have their own mandate, they all have their own charter. And within that, it's very clear what the eligibility is and the criteria as to what would get funded. So for the DSR banks, first of all, nations are going to have to decide, okay, what does that criteria look like? I think we can probably take some educated guesses here. And really, this is looking to fund, defense armaments and weaponry to be able to deter against Russia. And we can't be afraid of saying that. I think that half the problem is there's been a reluctance to invest in defense because there's almost a kind of a Voldemort type wraparound. You can't talk about it. You can't say it's like, well, my professional assessment is, Europe, we're in a state of war with Russia, and we can't hide from that. And it's not the type of war, perhaps, where bombs are raining down on London and Paris, although they clearly are in Kiev. It's a different type of war, but we're in it. We're engaged. And so you're going to need this bank to be able to spend on the types of armaments necessary to conventionally deter. But equally, we've got to make sure that we're not looking backwards. The temptation here will be that, okay, this is all about tanks, jets, planes, artillery. It's like, yeah, that's part of it. But actually, the most advanced army in Europe right now is the Ukrainian army. And they are doing things in a very different way. And so this bank would be looking to finance the sorts of new technologies that the Ukrainians have pioneered in the war against Russia. And so that needs to be absolutely factored in. Equally, though, we have to be slightly broader. So whilst that's a very clear defense element, the bank's called a DSR bank. It's a defense, security, and resilience bank. And so therefore, that also means funding for infrastructure security. We're seeing more and more engagements with regards to critical national infrastructure, undersea cables, pipelines, bridges, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to need more resource to be able to protect that. And we're also, be able to, going to be looking, I should say, to build resilience into our countries. Now, what does that actually mean in reality? It means that the model we've had up until now, or really since the mid-1970s, our economic model, the neoliberal model, has all been about efficiencies, maximizing efficiencies. And with resilience, you don't necessarily want to be totally efficient. You want to be really resilient and effective. And these are different things. And that means it's going to be slightly more expensive. So you don't just want, one factory churning out ammunition. You might want 3 or 4 distributed all over the place. And so therefore, you're going to need a financing instrument like this that can lend to nations at very long maturities, 30 plus years, backed by nation states at incredibly cheap rates, at AAA credit rating, the cheapest it can be, to allow nations to build up that resilience, which is a real mindset shift with regards to swapping out and trading efficiency for effectiveness. And so it's going to be focused on defense activities, weapon systems, making sure we're looking at new technologies, and also making sure we're thinking about all of our networks, and we shouldn't forget all of the software needed to be able to fight in the 21st century, but equally make sure we can genuinely win should we need to. So they're the sorts of areas that I would see this bank financing at quite large scale.
So you've mentioned multilateral several times, and implying countries, different governments would be involved in the DSR bank. Would that also extend into private company participation?
So the model for multilaterals is pretty well trodden. And so you can see, if we take the World Bank, for example, the actual shareholders of the bank are nations, countries, and nation states. That makes sense. However, they have grown multiple instruments underneath the World Bank group that include private capital. And that sort of model, I would absolutely see being applied to the DSR bank in time. It's probably not the first thing to sort of worry about, to be quite honest, but it would be applied in time, I suspect. But the other thing when we think about private investors is that whilst there could be an instrument within the umbrella of the DSR bank that allows for private, probably institutional investors, pension funds, insurance funds, etc., to crowd in, there's also going to be a huge secondary market here, because guarantees the DSR bank would provide to commercial banks so they can lend into the defense supply chain. That is going to just open up a whole new private market, in terms of private financing. So there is almost overnight with the DSR bank going to be use of private capital, which can flood into the market. And again, that starts to then build up resilience, because one of the problems we have in Europe at the moment is fundamentally we don't have the production capacity to build all this stuff. And so by definition, it means we have to create this bank with the United States, with Canada, with Australia, with our partners around the world, with allies. And Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, was really clear about this yesterday. Yesterday being the 26th of February, in Prime Minister's questions, he was asked a question about this by Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrat. He was asked a question, will the Prime Minister support a European multilateral defence bank? And the Prime Minister was clear. He said, well, no, we need the United States. We're not going to make a decision here where we exclude North America. And so the reason he said that was because he recognised that there isn't the production capacity to do this at the moment solely within Europe. But the politics right now make this quite tricky.
Right. And in that same Prime Minister's questions, when he made the announcement and he indicated where these defense budgets would be pulled from in the UK, which has spouted a lot of different conversations, at least on this island. It brings up defense budgets. What makes this different from just allocating more resource to defense budgets in individual countries?
Yeah, so the way defense budgets usually work in pretty much all countries is that they are decided on an annual basis, year by year. And what does that mean? It means for the defense industry, it's really hard to get confident that those budgets are going to endure, perhaps for the longevity of a contract. You might have a contract to build some amazing fast jet aircraft, and that contract might be 15 years, in order to just it takes a long time to build these aircraft. However, companies going to be really reticent to invest its own money in building all the factories, hiring all the people, purchasing all the equipment in order to scale up to sort of build all of that, if it doesn't have confidence that the budget is going to endure for those sort of 15 years. So what this means is that the reason defense expenditure, the stuff defense makes, tanks, submarines, jets, etc., the reason it's so expensive is because companies are pricing in the risk of, okay, what happens if this contract basically gets ripped up because of a new political party in post in 3 or 4 years' time? So the difference here is that a DSR, a multilateral bank, DSR bank, basically provides not in perpetuity, that's not true, but it provides financing over a very, very long time period. And so what that does is it gives you and the companies huge levels of confidence that this is going to happen. And the reason, and this is why I go back to my earlier point, like, what is this bank all about? It's about super cheap capital for nations. But point number 2, it's about helping to nudge procurement. So if a country borrows from this bank to invest in a new set of jets or submarines or whatever, there's going to be conditionality in those contracts to basically make sure that, okay, you're going to see this through. And if you're not, then you're on the hook. And so the way this bank would work is, let's imagine company X gets this contract. The bank would be able to issue the money directly to company X because they're in their hands. They have a written contract from the government that says, yes, we are going to buy these jets. No problem. If the government changes its mind 3 or 4 years later, then it won't be the company that's on the hook for that money. It will be the government. Okay, so again, what that does is it provides confidence to companies to invest, and therefore it reduces the cost of actually what's being produced, because the financing risk just isn't baked into the numbers. And so therefore, it's a very different way to support defense financing, a far more stable way and a far more counter-cyclical way. So when the economic bad times come, and they will, you've got an instrument here that is multinational, sits outside of government, and can be leaned on and used to maintain that level of investment. And that's how you start to build resilience, is what we need. So the way in which it's different to national budgets is pretty clear. But what we must understand is that this isn't a substitute for national spending on defense, right? This is not, nor is it a silver bullet, quite frankly. We're going to need 3 or 4 or 5 different sets of tools to deal with this problem. National spending is going to be 1, the DSR bank is going to be 2, There might be EU collected bonds, perhaps, or that's slightly sensitive for some EU nations. And there might be other options out there as well. We're going to need that menu out there to be able to give nations the best opportunities to finance all of this.
You've brought up Ukraine. Ukraine is the reason why we've co-founded Resilience Media. It's we all agree that we're at war right now. It just looks different than people are perhaps used to. Let's talk about Ukraine for a few minutes and today's threat landscapes. Ukraine has been incredibly innovative in terms of how it's responded to the full-scale Russian invasion, and it's shown how critical logistics, supply chains, industrial capacity are in today's day and age. So what lessons can we take from Ukraine about financial resilience?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think what the Ukrainians have done is quite unbelievable in how they've operated and functioned. And I think the one area which I would really love to see come in and be adopted is the notion of decentralized procurement. And so what Ukraine has done very well is that it has enabled many commanders at relatively tactical levels to be able to buy what they need. And not only buy what they need, but also work with companies and do incredibly rapid product development activities with frontline troops, with end users, things which in large corporates would take months, maybe even years. They're being done in days and weeks. And so I think that those sorts of lessons absolutely need to be coming back into Western militaries very, very fast. I mean, I look at what happened after the end of the Second World War, where the Americans and the Soviets went after German rocket scientists to pull them in to work on the space race. When this fourth ceasefire, peace, or whatever we want to call it, breaks out, there are going to be a huge swathe of incredibly talented Ukrainian entrepreneurs, technologists, business people, and I think it would be beholden for London, Paris, Berlin, etc., to actually really listen to these people as to how you fight to win in today's world, because they are the most experienced and the most advanced in Europe. And so the elements that they've brought about, especially focused on decentralization and rapid decision-making, that to me are principles, philosophical principles, that are now very much front and center of today's character of conflict.
Yeah. So how do we make a DSR bank happen? What are the biggest hurdles that you see into making it a reality?
So operationally, technically, it's very, very straightforward. Nations have done this multiple times in other areas. And it's perhaps worth, before I get into the specifics of that, Leslie, just perhaps noting why some people might be listening to this or watching this and think, well, why can't we just use one of these other banks to deal with this? Why do we need something new?
Good question.
And there's kind of two reasons to that, right? The first one is that, okay, of the 40 multilaterals that exist globally, none of them have a mandate for defense and security. Now, you could say, all right, fine, just change the charter, stick a mandate in. But those charters are international treaties. They've been ratified by parliaments of all of those shareholder nations or Congress. And so if you're going to open it up, you open the whole thing up and everything's kind of opened up. You can't just kind of slip in a sentence. And therefore, there isn't much appetite to do that for some of these banks. And that's why the European Investment Bank, which has been under a lot of political pressure to do defense spending, it's one of the reasons that they haven't gone down this path, is because there isn't the appetite in shareholder nations to completely open up their charter, because that could lead to all sorts of other discussions. Point one. Point two, let's imagine you do get the charter changed, all right, fine. The problem we've got with these existing banks is that they've all got billions of euros, billions of dollars, billions of pounds out deployed on various projects associated to their core mandate. So if you were to then layer on top bonds and loans for defense, it's simply not clear what the financial risk profile would be. And where financial risk can be measured quantitatively, it's not clear what that would be. And therefore, there is a risk to their AAA credit rating. And these banks are simply not going to do that. So So you have to start, if you're going to do this using a multilateral bank as one of your tools, like I say, it's going to be part of many tools, but one of your tools, then you have to start from the ground up. How do we do it? So the model, how you do this is pretty straightforward. Nations have done this many times on many other banks. The last one being the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015, 2016. So the model's straightforward. The challenge right now is politics, pure and simple. So, and that's why the discussion, on Sunday in London for defence spending is why on Thursday next week, 6th of March, we will see a follow-up meeting in Brussels with EU leaders. This is purely about politics and policy. And do nations want to do this? It's very clear to me. I've had many, many discussions with nations, with heads of state, in fact, and with ministers, that there is huge desire to do this. The question is how the political shaping comes into effect. And so I'm going to be a little cautious with my words on this because, this is a hypersensitive topic right now. We're right in the eye of the storm of it. And it's the politics is catching up to this now. I mean, just to go back slightly, I first started working on this in 2018. I'm probably one of the few people in the world that has done the level of research and analysis and engagement and knows how to build this. So that is fine, but we are now in a very much a sensitive political discussion. And I think going back to the Prime Minister's point yesterday in PMQs, he's laid it down very clearly that he wants to see a multilateral bank, but it has to be across the transatlantic environment as a minimum, and actually probably fold in the Indo-Pacific as well. So there are some sensitive discussions going on, and I think we're going to see more news on that in the coming days and weeks ahead.
Great. So if somebody's listening who wants to get involved, whether they're in government, defense, or in the private sector, what's the best way to get involved in the DSR Bank?
Well, I guess there's kind of 2 or 3 things. I mean, first of all, read my paper on the Atlantic Council website on the defense. It's going to take you probably 20-25 minutes to read. It is a relatively long paper, but it's the blueprint on how you do this. It explains a lot of the arguments, the logic, and objectively, I mean, that paper's been peer reviewed and went through a pretty rigorous publishing process. So read that paper, understand what we're talking about, because as I found in the last 5 years working on this, what we're really talking about here cuts across ministries of defense, ministries of financial affairs, foreign ministries, and sort of prime ministers and presidents' offices. And as such, it's really hard to stitch these communities together. So read, engage, get educated, point 1. And then point 2, if you see merit here, if you see this, that this kind of makes sense from your perspectives, then reach out, get in touch, talk to me. I'm working on a very interesting project at the moment, which we'll talk more about maybe next time if you invite me back, as to how we bring this to life. But I can't say too much in this moment in time. However, the nations are lining up behind this. That's very clear. And I am pretty confident that we will see some form of multilateral defense, security and resilience bank. I'm pretty confident that will happen. Exactly what flavor it takes is still to be determined. So, if this is of interest, then yeah, sure, get in touch and I'll be delighted to share more.
Super. One of the things that we did when we were in Munich at the end of every panel, we asked people to imagine we're 5 years in the future. What does success look like for the DSR Bank 5 years from now?
So I'd say there's probably 3 things here. The first is that the bank is established, it's got its balance sheet up and running, and is operational, lending to nations at the cheapest rate and allowing for defense capability, stuff, tech to get into the hands of operators as quickly as possible, whilst also investing in those necessary domestic security apparatus to build up the resilience. I see the balance sheet itself growing. I mean, I see the start point for this probably being in the 100 billion euros region, but I would see that growing over that 5-year period. And the final point is I would see lots more private capital co-investing through the DSR Bank and the shareholder nations expanding as well. So whilst we would start with a small group of anchor nations to get this going, which would be spread across the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions, I would see more countries coming on board and using this instrument to support their defense and security, and ultimately having government pulling capital markets to help with deterrence and do something which I would call capital market deterrence. That is where I see the success, because that is the sorts of hybrid activity that the future character of conflict is going to demand.
Are there any other points that you'd like to make for our listeners today, Rob, before we wrap up?
I don't think so, Leslie. I think that we've covered a lot of ground here. I think that the ask to your listeners is really to recognize that we are sadly in a state of conflict, and part of that and part of that winning process, and we need to recognize it's not about fighting, it's about winning, is actually bringing together the capital markets and financial instruments in line with our conventional, traditional hard power defense stuff, whilst also folding in new technologies. And those three things coming at a nexus and a converging. And people need to start thinking in that sort of manner when we start talking about national security.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Rob. It's been great to have you on, and we'll definitely have you back for an update when you're ready.
Thanks, Leslie.